I think I'm ready. Yeah. Hi, and welcome everybody to my talk. A couple of disclaimers ahead. I'm not a finance person, so don't get me too hard on finance or economic theory or anything. I'm a lawyer by training, as Vladimir explained, and currently I'm focused on my own startup, which is called FQX, where we create electronic negotiable instruments, so blockchain-based promissory notes. Also at my PhD, I'm looking at topicalities such as that at the University of Paris. So what I want to talk to you today is mainly based on a recent paper that I published with a colleague from the University of Bern, where we looked at the role of the state and how it is shaped by digitization from a transaction cost perspective, looking at the state as just another institution and whether digitization shapes its very being and its sphere of influence. We looked at that from the perspective of a couple of case studies, and these case studies did not include financial markets, so today I'm first going to talk a little bit about what we did in this paper and then expand it to include a view on financial markets. So the case studies that we did was on the one hand on the Network Enforcement Act in Germany, known by the beautiful German name as Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, the NetzDG short, the Swiss Gambling Act, and then I'm quickly going to talk about what perspective we used for this paper. It was more of a proposal for a new research agenda in public law, looking at it from this economic analysis of law perspective. Then we're going to look at what impact does this digitization have on the regulation of financial markets, as this is also part of public law, and we have some time for Q&A and discussions. So the Network Enforcement Act basically was a result of a perceived surge of hate crime on social media, such as Facebook. So regulators and law enforcers were confronted with people calling each other bad things, inciting hatred on Facebook, saying things that go against racial that are considered racial discrimination, etc. And given how many monthly users there are of Facebook in Germany alone, there's roughly 37 million, the state enforcer or law enforcer did not see itself anymore in the position to actually enforce the German penal code. So what it did is it started to come up with this law, the Network Enforcement Act, where this pivotal law enforcement responsibility to make sure that the penal code is not violated on German ground or within the German jurisdiction, and they passed on the responsibility of this enforcement to private companies such as Facebook. So the Act forces social networks above a certain size to monitor all of the publications, all of the posts within this social network, and within 24 hours react to complaints that are flagged, and if they deem a certain post to be violating certain articles of the German Penal Code, again, incitement of violence, they must make the decision themselves to take it down or not, so to censor this content, which has been proven in other jurisdictions as well to have a chilling effect. So obviously, because they get fines if they don't censor this kind of content, later on it will be found out that in fact it was a violation of the penal code, they face fines. And so this leads to a chilling effect where if they have the choice and something is ambiguous, maybe a satirical post or something, they will rather censor the post than leave it. And we argue that this Enforcement Act itself, or this legislative act itself, is a result of the cost of publicly voicing one's opinion, of publicly communicating, dramatically decreasing via digitization. So before, when it came to enforcing the penal code in terms of public incitement of violence, etc., law enforcers had it rather easily. So they could either look at the weak pressure points of traditional media, where you have a company posting content, or you can go to the public square. With Facebook and other social media, this new public sphere was created, much larger, and the cost of any individual to disseminating one's opinion decreased so much that a flood of new content and content producers arise. Another example is the Gambling Act in Switzerland. It's a similar, let's say, context where, because of digitization, the cost of providing gambling services has decreased dramatically. You don't actually need a brick and mortar Spielbank. You can just set up your online service. You can have any kind of blockchain-based prediction market and offer your own gambling services. So the regulatory action the state legislator chose was to block the access of foreign gambling sites and only allow the access to Swiss licensed gambling sites. If we now look at these two examples and what they have in common and what they showcase, we see that it's the reaction of the state legislator to changes in, our opinion, transaction costs that have allowed new content producers, new producers of gambling services to really spring out from the ground. And we argue that they were faced with taking these sometimes extreme measures because these weak pressure points disappeared. So you couldn't anymore, as I said, go to the newspaper, the publishing house, person organizing an event, or the Spielbank. You have to look much more broader and also in a cross-border context. And the state currently does not have the means to fully govern and surveil that. Ergo, it takes these measures. What they also have both in common, that according to legal scholars, both of these acts violate other principles of public law. So the Network Enforcement Act arguably violates the German Grundgesetz with access, the access to information right. Similar things have been argued for the Gambling Act as well. What we looked at in the paper specifically was in that. Currently, when people look at the digitization specifically of public law, being the sphere of the state regulator, that they look at it from within the box. So they say, how is digitization going to change how I'm going to calculate my taxes? What is going to happen with algorithmic justice, courts making decisions based on algorithms, etc. But this is all within the box. And literature does not often focus on what happens with the box, with the state as an organization, as an institution, and how digitization influences how the state can exert control and remain the enforcer of the law. So if you look at, we have three possible spheres. There's the larger sphere of looking even at what happens when digitization hits our very biological and psycho or neurological fundament. The other sphere is what I just mentioned. It's the sphere of looking at the organization and the system, being the box and how it changes. And the lower sphere is the one that I just mentioned, where literature will currently focus on. So if we ask ourselves, to which degree is the shape and size of states and organized communities determined by their technological environment? Arguably, in our opinion, it is very strongly influenced by it. We've seen it with gunpowder, how gunpowder changed how states went into combat with each other, and we argue that digitization is, in its impact, comparable to that. And to bind this all together and have one narrative or one perspective from which we looked at this, we chose the perspective of transaction costs. Going all the way back to Coase, as you know, the state is an institution just as markets and firms, and it's explained, at least in the form of a reductio ad absurdum, via the existence of transaction costs. Therefore, it's clear if transaction costs change, the institution, the state, will change with it. Here again, this is not something a goal that we look at to reduce the state or eliminate the state. It was really just from a objective, neutral perspective. And as is shown, technological disruption is a driver of structural changes in transaction costs. As these two examples highlight very well, there's many other case studies to look at where technological change oftentimes decreases transaction costs, allowing for more players to come in, produce content, offer services, and access services. And what does, so this is then the research agenda we proposed. The state and public law must be conceptualized as tools to deal with transaction costs or changes in transaction costs. So, as is the case, there are things that we want to leave open to the market from a policy perspective, and there's things we want to regulate because the social cost, if you left it to the market, for example, security, law enforcement, are considered to be too high, at least in most modern democracies. And what you can do with it is identify the space for regulation and look at it from the perspective of this tool. And then you can make assumptions of how are certain technological developments going to change the sphere of influence of the state, and how might you react to that. And what I want to show later is also that it's not always going into one way, where we argue that digitization via the change of transaction costs decreases the sphere of influence of the state. We've seen in many examples it can also go the other way, where the state can expand its sphere of influence with the lowering of transaction costs. One example would be states such as China, where they have new means of surveillance via digitization that make the cost of regulation and the cost of surveillance much lower, arguably increasing this sphere of influence. Now, if we look at digitization specifically and the regulation of financial markets, one thing came to my mind, something that I've experienced myself working for fintechs and blockchain companies in that time, and that was the ICO craze in 2017, 2018. All of a sudden, all you needed in order to access the capital markets, either as a trader or if you wanted to raise funds, was a smart contract, not even maybe just a Bitcoin wallet and a website, and you would say, I'm doing an ICO, please transfer money, this is going to be great, etc. So obviously, if you look at how fundraising in such high amounts was done before, it was done via regulated intermediaries, such as investment bank, corporate finance boutiques, regulated exchanges that controlled secondary markets, or at least regulated traders that were part of OTC markets. What happened here is you had this flood of ICOs, and we're talking about, I think one number I looked at was a total amount raised of 8 billion in the year of 2018, 8 billion venture capital basically, where no VC or regulated exchange was involved. So here again, the regulators, and I think this was a topic very present with many people involved in the crypto community, had to react. Sometimes they reacted strongly. You saw that with the SEC in the US. Others were more lenient, took an approach, let's wait and see. But what you can definitely argue is that there were many violations of regulatory law along the way. So insider trading, which does apply to some crypto assets, is virtually existent in very many of these unregulated exchanges, and there are no disclosure requirements. All of these things that the financial market regulators have come up with to ensure the function of the markets are virtually inexistent. And many cross-border unregulated securities transactions were done along the way. So people making an ICO in Switzerland and selling those securities without a prospectus, without any potential license, to 100 jurisdictions around the world, not doing any KYC, etc. So we can definitely state that law was broken there. But maybe as opposed to, again, the traditional financial markets, where the regulators had the weak pressure points, these weak pressure points here, at least for this time span, virtually disappeared. So regulators had to kind of accept and let go that a lot of violations of law happened. And then, while in this time, come up with strategies how to tackle this. Because in our opinion, this is not going to go away. This could potentially increase. So where you have more and more extra-legal financial transactions of a considerable size. And specifically in this case, regulators responded with either a tougher stance on existing interpretations of regulation. We had the SEC interpreting case law in a very strong and tough way that surprised many participants. The same happened with FINMA, that currently takes a very tough stance on regulation, using, let's say, legal instruments or legal figures that are rather surprising to many lawyers. For example, the discussion whether token-based share registers are security settlement systems, something which is denied by most legal scholars, but currently something that FINMA looks as a viable interpretation. Another thing we saw on the side of China, for example, was a complete ban of these activities and an increase in surveillance to deal with it. If we try to take an outlook now, where can this go in the future? And what will be the impact be on financial markets, on financial transactions? I see three ways on the combination of each of these three ways as possible. One thing we've seen is kind of an immediate reaction can be tougher regulation. However, I do think that is something that is unsustainable. You see, it sometimes can seem as a measure of last resort, a desperate measure. You just increase regulation, trying to create incentives for people to comply, because you know, in fact, you cannot really prevent them from taking part in an ICO, taking part in a cross-border exchange that is unregulated, and buying these unregulated securities. Another reaction is the other one we talked about, is it leads to a reduction of the sphere of influence of regulators. They might step back in some ways because they don't have the means, or as we've seen in the example of the Network Enforcement Act, they could get more private companies involved in the enforcement process. Maybe as we have a private security, you would have private companies monitoring, making sure that compliance is met. Something we see in Switzerland right now with FINSA, Financial Services Act, coming into force 1st of January. And Switzerland opted to have also this hybrid process where we do have for the first time a regulatory law process for prospectuses outside of the collective investment scheme area. But the institutions which are going to check and approve these prospectuses are private institutions. And another interesting thing is also maybe an appeal to regulators, if some of you are involved in them, is rather than being, kind of defeatist, using technology and digitization as a tool to see how you can expand your influence where we deem it's a legitimate influence. And one of the very interesting develops in this space, in my opinion, is compliance by design. So the discussion to have a priori when setting up business processes, potential financial transactions, a regulatory protocol in place. This could be, automated reporting to the financial regulators directly via an input. This is something that Corda has worked on together with the FCA in the UK, where you have a direct and immediate mortgage reporting. Another thing that I think is extremely interesting is if you look at programmable securities, meaning that you would ask people who conduct a securities offering to use a blockchain protocol where some jurisdictions where the prospectus was not listed or notified are blacklisted, so you can make sure that these securities technologically cannot travel to someone with an IP where in this jurisdiction no prospectus exists. But yeah, many other things to think about, and I hope I was able to give you a bit of an overview. And if you want to read the paper, I'll happily send it to you via email. It's in German, however, but yeah, you can use DeepL, very, very good translations.